This video is created for storytelling while the real names, locations, and identifying information have been changed to protect the privacy and dignity of the individuals and families involved. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. In the early spring of 1943, a boy named Arthur Keaton was born on the south side of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. On the outside, the Keaton family looked ordinary. Arthur's father, Harold Keaton, was a decorated veteran from the Second World War who worked long hours as a machinist. His mother, Eleanor, stayed home raising Arthur and his two older sisters. To neighbors, they seemed like a typical working-class American family trying to rebuild life after the war. Inside the house, however, things were very different. Harold Keaton carried the anger of war with him everywhere he went. He drank heavily and had little patience for weakness of any kind. Arthur, unfortunately, was the child who attracted most of that anger. From an early age, he struggled with a congenital heart condition that kept him from playing sports or keeping up with other children. While the neighborhood boys ran through alleys playing baseball or football, Arthur often sat on the porch watching. To his father, that was unacceptable. Harold believed boys should be tough, athletic, and fearless. Arthur was none of those things. He was quiet, overweight, and often sick. The disappointment his father felt quickly turned into cruelty. Verbal insults were common in the Keaton household. Arthur was called lazy, useless, and weak more times than he could count. Sometimes the anger turned physical. Eleanor tried to protect her son whenever she could. She often stepped between father and child, shielding Arthur from the worst of the outbursts. But her protection came at a cost. Harold mocked Arthur even more, calling him a mother's boy and accusing Eleanor of raising him soft. The young boy learned early that silence was safer than speaking. School was not much easier. Because of his heart condition, Arthur spent several years in and out of hospitals as a teenager. Doctors struggled to explain a series of fainting spells and seizures that appeared when he was 14. Between the medical issues and frequent absences, Arthur found it difficult to form friendships. Isolation became normal. During those long hospital stays, Arthur developed a habit of watching people carefully. Nurses, doctors, visitors, other patients. He observed how people behaved, how they spoke, and how they reacted to kindness. Over time, he realized something important. If he behaved the way people expected, they tended to trust him. That realization would shape the rest of his life. When Arthur turned 20, he left Milwaukee and moved west to Las Vegas, Nevada, hoping to start fresh. The city was booming during the early 1960s, and jobs were easy to find for someone willing to work hard. Arthur eventually took a position as an assistant at a small funeral home. The work was quiet and solitary, late nights, long hours, and very little supervision. For most people, the job might have been unsettling. For Arthur, it was strangely comforting. The dead were silent. They didn't judge him, argue with him, or insult him the way his father had. After about a year in Las Vegas, Arthur returned to Wisconsin and enrolled in a small business college. He studied accounting and management, graduating in 1964 with decent marks. By then, he had learned how to present himself as confident, polite, and dependable. People liked him. Not long after finishing school, Arthur met a young woman named Linda Carver at a community dance. She was friendly, optimistic, and impressed by Arthur's ambition. Within a year, they were married. Linda's father owned several fast food restaurants in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and offered Arthur a management job. For the first time in his life, Arthur seemed to be building something stable. He worked hard, kept the restaurants profitable, and became involved in local civic organizations. One of those organizations was a community leadership group called the Young Citizens League. The club focused on volunteer work, charity events, and political engagement. Arthur joined eagerly and quickly rose through the ranks. Members admired his reliability and calm personality. By the late 1960s, Arthur Keaton appeared to be a model citizen. He managed multiple restaurants, he volunteered in the community, he attended charity events and political fundraisers. He was known as a polite, dependable family man. But behind the scenes, something darker was beginning to develop. Arthur enjoyed power over others. At first, it appeared in small ways. He liked hiring young employees who depended on him for work. He liked hosting private gatherings in his basement where alcohol flowed freely and the rules were loose. At these gatherings, he often tested boundaries. If someone objected to a joke or a comment, Arthur would laugh and brush it off as harmless humor. Most people believed him. The carefully constructed mask of friendliness protected him. In 1968, however, the mask cracked for the first time. A young employee accused Arthur of inappropriate behavior after a company party. The accusation created tension in the small community. Arthur denied everything and insisted the claim was a misunderstanding. With no clear evidence and Arthur's strong reputation in town, the situation faded quietly. Still, whispers began to circulate. The pressure eventually strained his marriage. Linda filed for divorce a year later and moved away with their children. Arthur rarely spoke about them afterward. To the public, he remained calm and composed. Inside, something had shifted. In 1971, Arthur returned to the Midwest and settled in a quiet neighborhood in Riverton, Illinois, just outside Chicago. He purchased a modest two-story house on a tree-lined street and started a construction business called Keaton Contracting. The company grew quickly. Arthur was hard-working, organized, and willing to take on long hours. Within a few years, he had several employees and steady contracts, renovating homes and small businesses around the city. He also returned to community activities. Arthur volunteered with a local political organization and eventually helped coordinate neighborhood festivals and charity events. He even joined a clown entertainment group that performed at hospitals and community celebrations. Children laughed, parents applauded, photographs were taken. The man behind the painted smile seemed harmless. But neighbors occasionally noticed strange things. Arthur often returned home very late at night. Lights inside the house flickered on and off at odd hours. Work trucks came and went long after midnight. At first, people assumed he was simply busy with construction projects. Then, in the summer of 1974, a young man who had briefly worked for Keaton Contracting disappeared after telling friends he was heading to Arthur's house to discuss a job opportunity. No one immediately connected the disappearance to Arthur. Why would they? He was polite, he was helpful, he performed at charity events as a cheerful clown named Benny the Builder. Arthur Keaton had spent years perfecting the role of a trustworthy man, and by the mid-1970s, he had become extremely good at it. What no one in Riverton realized was that behind the friendly reputation and community involvement, Arthur had begun living a second life, one built on manipulation, control, and secrets hidden beneath the floors of his quiet suburban home. The town still saw him as a hard-working businessman and volunteer, but the darkness that had quietly grown inside Arthur Keaton since childhood was no longer hiding, and soon Riverton would discover just how dangerous their trusted neighbor was. By the beginning of 1949, Adrian Marcus Hale believed he had perfected his method. 4 people had vanished over the course of several years. No bodies had been found. No direct evidence had tied him to the disappearances. The acid in his workshop had erased almost every trace of what he had done. To the outside world, Adrian appeared to be a quiet and successful engineer living at the Ashbourne Court Hotel in South Kensington. He dressed well, spoke politely, and kept mostly to himself. Other residents considered him an intelligent but slightly reserved man. But behind that calm appearance, Adrian was running out of money again. His gambling habit had slowly consumed the fortune he stole from the Whitaker family and the Carringtons. The comfortable lifestyle he had created was expensive, and the hotel bills alone were beginning to pile up. Soon, he would need another victim. That victim appeared in the form of Margaret Devereaux, a wealthy widow who also lived at the Ashbourne Court Hotel. Margaret was 69 years old and known among the residents as an energetic and talkative woman. Her late husband had been a successful solicitor, leaving her with a comfortable inheritance. She enjoyed discussing business ideas and inventions, often sharing imaginative concepts that she believed could make her fortune even larger. Adrian listened carefully whenever she spoke. One evening in the hotel lounge, Margaret excitedly described an idea she had for artificial fingernails made from a new synthetic material. She believed the invention could become extremely popular if someone could help her produce it. Adrian immediately saw an opportunity. He told her he had access to a private workshop where experimental manufacturing could take place. If she wanted, he could show her the space and discuss how the invention might be developed. Margaret was thrilled. Within days, the two arranged to meet at Adrian's workshop on Ravenhurst Lane. On the afternoon of February 18, 1949, Margaret arrived at the building carrying a small notebook filled with sketches of her idea. Adrian greeted her warmly and led her inside the dim basement room. The oil drum still stood against the wall, hidden behind wooden panels. Margaret noticed none of it. As she leaned over a workbench to explain her design, Adrian quietly stepped behind her with the revolver he had stolen months earlier. The gun fired once. Margaret collapsed instantly. For Adrian, the process had become almost routine. He stripped the valuables from her body, including an expensive Persian fur coat and several pieces of jewelry. Then he placed her body inside one of the acid drums and sealed the lid. The chemical reaction began immediately. To Adrian, the crime seemed as perfect as the others, but this time something went wrong. The following morning at the Ashbourne Court Hotel, residents noticed that Margaret had not appeared for breakfast. It was unusual. Margaret was known for greeting the staff early each day, often discussing her latest ideas over tea. Her absence quickly became a topic of concern among the guests. Several people asked Adrian if he had seen her, since they knew the two had planned to meet the previous afternoon. Adrian calmly replied that Margaret had failed to show up for their meeting. He suggested she might have changed her plans at the last minute. At first, everyone accepted the explanation, but as another day passed with no sign of her, worry began to spread through the hotel. One of the guests, Mrs. Eleanor Lane, decided she would report Margaret missing to the police. When Adrian heard this, he offered to drive her to the station. The gesture seemed helpful and cooperative, but it would turn out to be his greatest mistake. At the Chelsea police station, Adrian calmly repeated the story he had told everyone else. He explained that Margaret had planned to meet him but never arrived. Sergeant Richard Latham, the officer taking the report, listened carefully. Something about Adrian's manner felt strange. He appeared calm, almost too calm. Latham decided to check Adrian's background through the police records office. The results arrived the following morning. Adrian Hale had a long history of fraud and deception, including several prison sentences under different business schemes. Now Latham was suspicious. Meanwhile, Adrian had returned to his workshop early that morning to finish disposing of Margaret's remains. The acid had almost completely dissolved her body, leaving only a thick chemical residue. Instead of draining the liquid properly, Adrian dumped part of the mixture behind the building. It was a careless decision, and it would soon cost him everything. That same afternoon, police officers arrived at the Ashbourne Court Hotel and asked Adrian to come with them for further questioning. He remained calm. He believed there was still no evidence connecting him to Margaret's disappearance. But while Adrian sat in an interview room, detectives searched his workshop on Ravenhurst Lane. Inside, they discovered several disturbing items: a rubber apron, a gas mask, empty acid containers, and a recently fired revolver. But the most shocking discovery was outside the building. Among the rubble where Adrian dumped the acid mixture, investigators found strange human remains. There were lumps of melted body fat, fragments of bone, and pieces of a denture that could later be traced to Margaret Devereux. The case against Adrian began forming quickly. When he was brought back for questioning, Detective Inspector Charles Webb confronted him with the evidence. At first, Adrian remained silent. Then he asked a strange question. "Tell me," he said quietly, "what are the chances of someone being released from Broadmoor?" Broadmoor was a high-security psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane. Inspector Webb replied that he couldn't answer such a question. Adrian leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Well," he said, "if I told you the truth, you might not believe it." Moments later, he confessed, not only to the murder of Margaret Devereux, but also to the killings of the Whittaker family and the Carringtons. He even claimed responsibility for several other murders, though those victims were never confirmed. After years of deception, Adrian Hale had finally revealed the truth. The trial began in July 1949 at the Lewiston Assizes Court. Adrian's defense centered around a shocking claim. He told the court he suffered from vampiric urges and had consumed the blood of his victims. He described recurring nightmares filled with visions of blood and claimed these hallucinations had driven him to kill. The story sounded bizarre and horrifying, but investigators believed it was nothing more than a desperate attempt to appear insane and avoid execution. The prosecution argued that Adrian's crimes had been carefully planned and financially motivated. Every murder had been committed to gain money or property from his victims. His actions were not madness, they were calculated. After hearing all the evidence, the jury needed only 15 minutes to reach their verdict: guilty. When the judge asked Adrian if he had anything to say before sentencing, he simply replied, "Nothing at all." The court sentenced him to death by hanging. Adrian spent his final weeks at Wexford Prison writing letters and giving interviews about his life. He spoke calmly about the murders, often describing them as though they were experiments rather than crimes. On the morning of August 10, 1949, Adrian Hale was led to the gallows by the prison executioner. Witnesses later said he remained completely composed until the very end. Moments later, the lever was pulled, and the man who dissolved his victims in acid finally met his own fate. The case shocked the public across England. Never before had a killer used such a strange and disturbing method to erase his crimes. Newspapers quickly labeled Adrian Hale the acid barrel murderer. Even decades later, the story remained one of the most chilling criminal cases in British history. Because what made Adrian Hale truly terrifying wasn't just the method he used, it was how ordinary he seemed. A polite man, a talented pianist, a neighbor you might trust, until the day he decided you were worth to him dead than alive. The smell inside Arthur Keaton's house on Willow Creek Drive was faint at first, but once the detective noticed it, he couldn't ignore it. Years of police work had taught him that certain odors meant only one thing: something beneath the house was decomposing. The officers finished their initial search that evening without tearing up the floors, but the suspicion was now impossible to dismiss. When they stepped outside, one of the detectives quietly told his partner that they needed a more thorough warrant. Something inside that house was very wrong. Over the next 2 days, investigators continued their surveillance of Arthur while preparing legal approval for a deeper search of the property. Arthur seemed calm, almost unusually calm. He continued his routine as if nothing had changed. He visited job sites, met with clients, and even attended a small community meeting. Detectives watching him later said it was unsettling how normal he appeared. But pressure was beginning to build. Police cars were now parked down the street almost every evening. Detectives were asking more questions in the neighborhood. Former employees of Keaton Contracting were being contacted. Arthur knew the investigation was closing in. On the morning of December 21, 1978, he arrived unexpectedly at the Riverton police station and asked to speak with detectives. The officers who met him later said he looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept properly in days. For several minutes, he simply sat in silence. Then he quietly said something that would later be repeated in court for years. "There are things in my house you're going to find." At first, the detectives thought he might be referring to evidence connected to the disappearance of Michael Reyes, but Arthur continued speaking in a detached, almost emotionless tone. He told them there were bodies, many bodies. He claimed most of them were buried in the crawl space beneath his home. Investigators were stunned. Even experienced homicide detectives rarely heard confessions like that. Still, they had no way of knowing whether Arthur was telling the truth, exaggerating, or attempting to mislead them. Within hours, a full search team arrived at the house on Willow Creek Drive. The crawl space entrance was located through a small hatch in the hallway floor. When officers opened it, they discovered standing water covering most of the ground beneath the house. A broken sump pump had allowed rainwater to flood the area. Before investigators could begin digging, they had to replace the pump and wait for the water to drain. It took several hours. When the water finally lowered enough for officers to enter the crawl space, the first discovery came quickly. Just a few inches beneath the damp soil, investigators uncovered human remains. As the search continued, the scale of the crime slowly became clear. More bodies were found, then more. Some were buried side by side. Others had been placed in shallow trenches dug through the dirt beneath the house's foundation. Detectives worked carefully, documenting every discovery while forensic teams photographed and cataloged each location. By the end of the excavation, the number of victims was far beyond what anyone had expected. The quiet suburban home had hidden one of the most horrifying crime scenes investigators had ever encountered. Arthur Keaton had murdered over 30 young men during the previous several years. Many of the victims were teenagers or young adults who had been searching for work, traveling through the city, or trying to start new lives. Several had been reported missing by their families. Others had disappeared so quietly that no one realized they were gone until investigators began identifying the remains. The news shocked the entire country. Neighbors in Riverton struggled to understand how someone they had seen at community events and children's festivals could be responsible for something so monstrous. Photographs soon circulated showing Arthur dressed as Benny the Builder, the clown who had once entertained at local hospitals. The image of the cheerful performer now carried a much darker meaning. During police interviews, Arthur described the methods he used to control his victims. He spoke about the handcuff trick he used to restrain them and the rope he used to strangle them. His explanations were calm and technical, as if he were describing routine work rather than violent crimes. At times, he showed little emotion at all. Yet even after confessing to the killings, Arthur's story continued to shift. In later statements, he claimed some of the deaths had been accidents or acts of self-defense. At other times, he suggested other unknown individuals had been involved. Investigators found no evidence supporting those claims. The physical evidence inside the house told a clear story. Arthur Keaton had acted alone. His trial began in February 1980 and quickly became one of the most closely watched criminal cases in the country. Prosecutors presented detailed evidence gathered from the house, the crawl space, and Arthur's own statements. The defense attempted to argue that Arthur suffered from severe mental illness and could not fully understand his actions. Psychiatrists hired by the defense described him as deeply disturbed, shaped by years of childhood abuse and psychological trauma. Prosecutors disagreed. They argued that Arthur's crimes showed careful planning and deliberate control. The methods he used, the way he concealed the bodies, and the years he spent hiding his actions all pointed to someone who understood exactly what he was doing. The jury ultimately agreed with the prosecution. After several weeks of testimony and only a few hours of deliberation, Arthur Keaton was found guilty of multiple counts of murder. The court sentenced him to death. During the years that followed, Arthur remained incarcerated at Stonegate Correctional Facility, where he spent much of his time filing appeals and giving occasional interviews. In those interviews, he often contradicted himself. Sometimes he admitted responsibility. Other times he insisted he had been forced to bury bodies for someone else. In one particularly strange interview, he even demonstrated the rope knot he had used on his victims, explaining how the tightening loop worked. The chilling demonstration only reinforced the prosecution's claim that Arthur had carefully developed his method over time. While in prison, Arthur also began painting. Many of his paintings featured clown figures, similar to the character he had once performed in public. Some were colorful and childish, while others were dark and unsettling. After his execution years later, several of those paintings were purchased by collectors and crime memorabilia dealers. Some victims' families later bought a few of the paintings themselves, destroying them in a symbolic act meant to erase the killer's legacy. Despite the trial and investigation, several victims were never fully identified. Their names remain unknown to this day. The case of Arthur Keaton left a permanent mark on Riverton and on criminal history. For many investigators, it became a powerful reminder that appearances can be dangerously misleading. Arthur had spent years building the image of a trustworthy man, a businessman, a volunteer, a clown who made children laugh. Behind that carefully crafted image was a predator who had hidden unimaginable crimes beneath the floors of his own home. And for the quiet neighborhood on Willow Creek Drive, the discovery beneath that house would forever change the way people looked at the man they once believed they knew.
In the winter of 1935, in the industrial city of Riverton, Ohio, a boy named Daniel Rowan was born into a life that seemed unstable from the very beginning. His mother, Clara Rowan, was only 16 years old when he was born. She had already run away from her family the year before and survived mostly by drifting from town to town, relying on temporary work and the kindness of strangers. Daniel's father was a mystery for many years. Clara told different stories to different people. Eventually, relatives learned that the likely father was a traveling laborer from Kentucky named Frank Dalton, a man with a reputation for scams and small cons. When Clara informed him about the pregnancy, Dalton vanished almost immediately, leaving no forwarding address and never returning. So Daniel grew up without a father and with a mother who was barely able to take care of herself. Clara's life revolved around bars, cheap apartments, and unstable relationships. She married briefly when Daniel was still a toddler. Her new husband, Arthur Rowan, gave the boy his last name, though the marriage itself didn't last long. Within a few years, Arthur disappeared from their lives entirely. For Daniel, childhood meant constant movement. Some months he lived with his mother. Other times he was sent to stay with relatives who didn't really want him. Discipline in those homes was harsh. Several family members later admitted that Daniel was frequently beaten for minor mistakes or punished simply for being difficult to control. School never lasted long for him. By the time he was 9, Daniel had already stopped attending classes regularly. Teachers described him as quiet but unpredictable. He often seemed angry or withdrawn, and when he did speak, it was usually to challenge authority. Instead of school, Daniel spent most of his time wandering around the city streets. Petty theft soon followed. At first, it was small things: candy from a corner shop, a pocket knife from a hardware store display. But as he grew older, the crimes became bolder. By his early teenage years, he had already been arrested multiple times for stealing bicycles, breaking into parked cars, and shoplifting. Authorities began sending him to reform schools. These institutions were supposed to help troubled teenagers learn discipline and structure. For Daniel, however, they became places where he learned something else entirely. Inside the reform facilities, Daniel was smaller than many of the other boys. That made him a frequent target for bullying and violence. Later in life, he would claim he had been beaten repeatedly and forced to defend himself constantly just to survive. Whether exaggerated or not, those experiences hardened him. But they also taught him something important. People could be controlled if you understood their fears and weaknesses. Daniel watched how stronger boys intimidated others. He noticed how some inmates gained protection by aligning themselves with influential groups. Most importantly, he began experimenting with persuasion. If he could convince someone that he was their friend, their protector, or their leader, he could influence what they did. These early lessons would shape the rest of his life. By the time Daniel reached 19, he had already spent several years moving in and out of detention centers. Surprisingly, prison officials described him as a model inmate when he wanted to be. He could follow rules perfectly when it benefited him. Because of that behavior, he was released early on parole. Not long after leaving custody, Daniel met a 17-year-old diner waitress named Evelyn Carter. She was young, optimistic, and impressed by Daniel's confident personality. To her, he seemed like someone who had simply been misunderstood by the world. The two married quickly. For a brief moment, Daniel appeared ready to build a normal life. They moved west to California, hoping for better opportunities. A year later, their son was born. But Daniel struggled with ordinary work. Steady employment bored him. Rules irritated him. Within months, he returned to the only lifestyle he truly understood: crime. He began stealing cars across California and selling them through underground contacts. The money came quickly, but so did the police. Daniel was arrested again and sentenced to several years in prison. While he served that sentence, Evelyn filed for divorce and took her child with her. Daniel barely reacted when he heard the news. Those who knew him later said he rarely formed emotional attachments in the first place. Prison, however, gave him something new. During his incarceration, he began learning how to play the guitar. At first, it was simply a way to pass time, but Daniel soon became obsessed with music. He practiced for hours every day and convinced himself that he possessed extraordinary talent. By the time he was released, he had developed a strange dream. He believed he was destined to become a famous musician. In 1966, after spending nearly half of his life in various correctional facilities, Daniel Rowan was released once again. He was now 31 years old. Prison officials later recalled something unusual about that release. Daniel reportedly asked whether he could remain incarcerated instead of being released. Life outside felt unfamiliar to him. Prison had structure, rules, and predictable routines. But the request was denied. So Daniel walked out into San Francisco with little money, a guitar slung over his shoulder, and a mind full of ambitions that few people could understand. The city he entered was changing rapidly. The late 1960s had created a culture filled with young people searching for freedom, identity, and new beliefs. Music, drugs, and counterculture movements filled the streets. For someone like Daniel, it was the perfect environment. He began spending time in parks and coffee houses, playing guitar and speaking passionately about life, society, and spiritual awakening. His conversations were unusual, sometimes confusing, but they were delivered with intense confidence. People listened. The first person truly drawn to him was a quiet university librarian named Laura Bennett. She invited Daniel to stay in her small apartment after hearing him perform music in a park. Within weeks, Laura became completely devoted to him. Soon, other young women started visiting the apartment as well. Many of them were runaways, struggling with addiction, or simply searching for meaning. Daniel welcomed them all. He spoke about rejecting society's rules and building a new kind of family where everyone belonged. Drugs, music, and endless conversations filled the apartment day and night. Daniel Rowan had never been able to control his own life, but now, for the first time, he was beginning to control the lives of others. And this strange, growing group of followers would soon become something far darker than anyone in San Francisco could imagine. By 1968, the strange community forming around Daniel Rowan had grown far beyond the small apartment in San Francisco where it began. What started as a handful of lost young people had slowly turned into a wandering group that referred to itself simply as the Circle. To outsiders, it looked like a group of hippies traveling together. But inside the group, Daniel was something far more than a friend. He was the leader. Most of the people drawn into the Circle were young women. Many had come from troubled homes or difficult pasts. Some had run away from abusive families. Others were searching for meaning in a world that felt chaotic and confusing. Daniel knew exactly how to speak to them. He talked about freedom from society's rules. He told them that traditional life was built on lies. He spoke about spiritual awakening, destiny, and a coming transformation that only a few enlightened people would understand. To the followers listening around campfires at night, Daniel sounded like a prophet. He also used more practical tools to maintain control. Drugs were always present, so was music. Daniel encouraged constant singing, long philosophical conversations, and loyalty tests that pushed members to prove their devotion. Over time, many of the followers began repeating his words as if they were sacred teachings. Some even started believing Daniel had supernatural insight. The Circle rarely stayed in one place for long. They moved from town to town in old vans and borrowed vehicles, surviving on odd jobs, stolen supplies, and money collected from sympathizers who admired their free-spirited lifestyle. But Daniel had bigger ambitions. He believed the group needed a permanent base somewhere more isolated, a place where the Circle could live without interference from the outside world. Around this time, Daniel reconnected with an old acquaintance from prison named Graham Harlow. Harlow was loosely connected to several musicians and artists in Southern California, and through him, Daniel found himself briefly stepping into a very different world. One evening, Harlow introduced him to Caleb Weston, a well-known rock musician whose band had recently achieved national fame. Weston was fascinated by Daniel. Like many people who met him for the first time, he was impressed with Daniel's ability to command attention in a room. Daniel spoke about music, philosophy, and the changing culture of the 1960s. His followers listened silently while he talked, which only added to the mysterious atmosphere surrounding him. Weston eventually invited Daniel and several members of the Circle to stay at his large house in the Hollywood Hills. For the group, it felt like stepping into another universe. Luxury cars filled the driveway. Parties lasted until sunrise. Famous actors and musicians drifted through the house almost every night. Drugs and alcohol were everywhere. Daniel loved it. He believed this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. He played his guitar constantly, performing songs for anyone who would listen. He insisted that his music was revolutionary and that the world simply hadn't discovered his genius yet. For a short time, it seemed like Daniel might actually break into the music industry. But the excitement didn't last. Weston's manager quickly became uncomfortable with the strange group living in the mansion. The followers wandered through the property freely, and Daniel often behaved as if the house belonged to him. Soon, Weston was pressured to ask them to leave. Just as quickly as the opportunity had appeared, it vanished.
Daniel took the rejection badly. He had convinced himself that fame and recognition were inevitable. When the doors of the music industry closed, his anger began to grow. He spoke bitterly about people who had betrayed him or failed to recognize his importance. At the same time, his speeches to the circle became darker. He began interpreting song lyrics, books, and religious passages as secret messages meant specifically for him. During late-night gatherings around fires, Daniel explained that society was heading toward a massive collapse. According to Daniel, a violent conflict was coming, a war that would destroy the existing world and create a new one. In this imagined future, Daniel believed the circle would rise to power. His followers listened closely. Some were confused, but many believed him completely. Not long after leaving Hollywood, the circle moved to an abandoned movie ranch outside San Marcos Valley, a dry stretch of land surrounded by desert hills. The property had once been used as a filming location for Western movies, but it had been deserted for years. The old buildings were broken down, but the isolation suited Daniel perfectly. Here, far away from city authorities, the circle could live exactly as he wanted. Days were spent scavenging for food, repairing old vehicles, or stealing supplies from nearby towns. Nights were devoted to gatherings around large fires where Daniel spoke for hours. His ideas grew increasingly extreme. He claimed that the coming conflict between races and governments would reshape the entire world. When that war began, Daniel said the circle would hide in the desert until the chaos ended. After that, they would emerge to lead the new society. Some followers accepted the story without question. Others simply trusted Daniel because they had nowhere else to go. But there was another side to the circle's life at the ranch: crime. Money was always short, and Daniel often sent members into nearby cities to steal vehicles, supplies, or valuables. These thefts became routine. The group even started dismantling stolen cars to build off-road vehicles they could use in the desert. Police occasionally investigated the thefts, but the ranch remained mostly overlooked. Still, Daniel's frustration continued to grow. He believed certain people had deliberately blocked his path to fame. One of those people was Victor Hale, a music producer Daniel had once met during his time in Hollywood. Hale had listened briefly to Daniel's songs, but rejected them immediately. To Daniel, that rejection became a personal betrayal. Around the same time, Daniel heard rumors that Graham Harlow, the man who had first introduced him to Hollywood circles, had recently come into a large amount of money. Daniel decided the circle should take it. In July of 1969, several members of the group visited Graham Harlow's small house outside San Marcos Valley. Their instructions were simple: demand the money and intimidate him until he handed it over. But the situation quickly spiraled out of control. When Harlow refused to cooperate, Daniel himself arrived at the house. Witnesses later said his behavior was terrifyingly calm. He spoke quietly to Harlow for several minutes before violence suddenly erupted. By the time the group left the house, Harlow was dead. The murder shocked even some of the members, but Daniel immediately reframed it as something necessary. He told them it was only the beginning. If the world was truly about to descend into chaos, they needed to take action first. And soon, Daniel Rowan would order the circle to carry out a series of crimes that would shock the entire country. The Night of Terror was coming, and once it began, nothing about the circle would ever remain hidden again. By the late summer of 1969, the atmosphere at the abandoned ranch outside San Marcos Valley had grown darker and more unstable. Daniel Rowan's speeches were no longer just strange philosophical ramblings. They had turned into intense predictions of violence.
Night after night, members of the circle gathered around fires while Daniel explained his vision of a coming social collapse. According to him, a massive conflict between different groups in society was inevitable. Governments would fall, cities would burn, order would disappear. Daniel insisted that this chaos had been predicted in music, religious texts, and hidden messages scattered throughout popular culture. But as weeks passed and nothing happened, his frustration grew. Eventually, Daniel told his followers that the coming disaster needed to be triggered. If the world refused to collapse on its own, he said, they would have to push it in the right direction. His plan was both simple and horrifying. A series of brutal killings would create fear across the country. Authorities would blame political groups or social movements, and the resulting panic would ignite the conflict Daniel believed was destined to begin. To some members of the circle, the idea sounded insane, but Daniel had spent years building their loyalty. Many followers believed he possessed a deeper understanding of the world. Others were simply afraid to challenge him. So when Daniel gave the order, they obeyed. The first attack happened in early August 1969. Daniel selected several loyal members of the circle, including Evan Cole, Rachel Turner, Maya Collins, and Lucas Reed. Their instructions were chillingly direct. Drive into the hills above Los Angeles, enter a large house Daniel had once visited, and kill everyone inside. Daniel also told them to make the scene look chaotic and symbolic. The more disturbing it appeared, the more attention it would attract. Shortly after midnight, the group arrived at the property, but Daniel didn't realize something had changed. The man he originally wanted to target, Victor Hale, had moved months earlier. The house was now being rented by a young film actress named Laura Kensington and her husband, who happened to be out of the country at the time. Laura was 8 months pregnant. That night, she had invited several friends over for dinner. The small group had spent the evening talking and relaxing, unaware that strangers were already moving through the dark property outside. The attackers cut the telephone line before approaching the house. Their first victim was a young man named Daniel Price, who had just finished visiting the property and was leaving in his car when he was suddenly ambushed near the gate. Moments later, the group forced their way inside the house. What followed was a brutal and chaotic attack that left everyone inside dead. Neighbors later reported hearing screams during the night, but the large property and thick walls prevented anyone from realizing the full horror of what had happened. Before leaving, the attackers wrote disturbing messages on the walls using their victims' blood. The city woke the next morning to headlines describing one of the most shocking crimes in recent memory. But the violence wasn't finished. The very next night, Daniel Rohn personally accompanied members of the circle to another house in a quiet neighborhood. This time, the victims were Michael and Andrea Vance, a middle-aged couple who owned several successful grocery stores in the area. According to later testimony, Daniel entered the house first. Once the couple was restrained, he left the actual killings to his followers. He ordered them to participate, insisting that every member needed to prove loyalty to the circle. The attack was just as brutal as the first. When police arrived the next morning, investigators found strange symbols and messages written on the walls again. The media immediately connected the crimes to the previous night's murders. Los Angeles was suddenly gripped with fear. Residents began locking their doors earlier. Neighborhood patrols formed. The police launched one of the largest investigations in the city's history. But the killers remained hidden for months. The break in the case came unexpectedly. In October 1969, several members of the circle were arrested for stealing vehicles and converting them into off-road buggies. The crime itself was minor compared to the murders police were investigating, but it placed multiple followers in jail together. One of them, Rachel Turner, couldn't resist bragging. While speaking with another inmate, she began describing the murders in disturbing detail, claiming she had been personally involved in the killing of the pregnant actress. The inmate immediately reported the conversation to authorities. Detectives reopened the investigation and began connecting the pieces. Physical evidence soon linked members of the circle to the crime scenes. Fingerprints, weapons, and witness statements slowly built a case against them. Police returned to the ranch outside San Marcos Valley and arrested Daniel Roan along with many of his followers. The trial that followed became a national spectacle. It began in July 1970, drawing enormous media attention. Reporters packed the courtroom every day, fascinated by the bizarre group and the strange influence Daniel seemed to have over them. Daniel's behavior during the trial only increased public curiosity. He often appeared in court wearing dirty clothing and behaving erratically. At one point, he carved a strange symbol into his own forehead, claiming it represented his separation from society. Several followers testified that Daniel had ordered the murders, even though he himself had not committed most of the killings himself. Prosecutors argued that his control over the circle made him just as responsible as the people who carried out the attacks. After months of testimony, the jury reached its decision. Daniel Roan and several of his closest followers were found guilty of multiple counts of first-degree murder. They were initially sentenced to death, but a change in state law soon converted those sentences to life imprisonment. Daniel spent the remainder of his life moving between high-security prisons across California. Even while incarcerated, he continued attracting attention from people fascinated by his strange philosophy and the shocking crimes he had inspired. Some saw him as a symbol of rebellion. Others viewed him as a manipulative predator who had exploited vulnerable people for power. In November 2017, after decades behind bars, Daniel Roan died in a California hospital at the age of 82. His death closed one chapter of the story, but the crimes committed by the Circle remain one of the most disturbing examples of how a single manipulative individual can twist belief, loyalty, and desperation into something deadly. The victims' families spent decades trying to rebuild their lives after the tragedy, and the events of those nights in 1969 continue to serve as a chilling reminder of how easily trust can be turned into control, and how dangerous that control can become when it falls into the wrong hands.